The radio crackled with static, then silence. In the pre-dawn darkness over the Hindu Kush Mountains, something had gone catastrophically wrong. Navy SEAL Team 6 was supposed to have air cover, a full squadron of F-22 Raptors maintaining overwatch for what intelligence had called a routine extraction. But as the digital clock in the command bunker ticked past 3:47 hours, every aircraft on the mission board showed red. Equipment failure, fuel leak, emergency landing. One by one, the most advanced fighter jets in the world had been grounded by a confluence of mechanical demons that defied statistical probability. Except for one. Ghost Rider 7, this is command. What's your status? The voice of Colonel Marcus Webb carried the weight of 27 years in the Air Force and the barely controlled panic of a man watching his carefully orchestrated mission crumble in real time. Command Ghost Rider 7. All systems green, maintaining patrol altitude. The voice that responded was steady, almost musical in its calm precision. It belonged to Captain Lysander Phoenix Reeves, whose call sign had become a source of bitter amusement among her squadron mates. They'd given it to her after she'd somehow walked away from a training crash that should have killed her, the third time she'd cheated death in as many years. Webb stared at the tactical display, where a single blue dot moved in measured circles above the mountains. Below, 8 of America's most elite warriors were pinned down in a compound that intelligence had assured them would be lightly defended. Those assurances had proven as reliable as the weather forecast. Phoenix, you're aware you're flying solo out there. Webb's question carried an undertone that everyone in the command center understood. One pilot, one aircraft, against an enemy force that had already demonstrated their willingness to turn a simple extraction into a bloodbath. Copy that, command. One is all you need when it's the right one. In the cockpit of her F-22 Raptor, 31,000 feet above the Afghan mountains, Lysander adjusted her grip on the stick and checked her weapons systems for the 4th time in 10 minutes. The HUD displayed a green constellation of ready indicators, but she knew that electronics could lie. What couldn't lie was the feeling in her bones, the same instinct that had kept her alive through 43 combat missions, when half her graduating class had either washed out or found reasons to request transfers to safer assignments. The mountains below were black velvet studded with occasional pinpricks of light, but her radar painted a different picture. Multiple contacts moving toward the compound where Team 6 had gone silent 12 minutes ago. The radio hissed again. Any station, this is Trident Actual. We are taking heavy fire and require immediate air support. How copy? Phoenix had been waiting for that call. The morning sun was still 3 hours away when Captain Lysander Reeves pushed her F-22 into a steep dive toward the mountains. But for the 8 Navy SEALs trapped in the valley below, dawn had never seemed so uncertain. The mission had been classified as low risk. Extract a high-value target from a compound that satellite imagery suggested housed no more than a dozen fighters. Intelligence, as Lysander had learned in 4 deployments, had a talent for being precisely wrong when it mattered most. Trident Actual, this is Phoenix. I have you on scope. What's your situation? Her voice carried across the tactical frequency with the kind of measured calm that senior NCOs spent years trying to teach young soldiers. In the compound below, Staff Sergeant Tommy Kowalski pressed his back against a mud brick wall and keyed his radio while AK-47 rounds chewed chunks from the corner above his head. Phoenix, we've got approximately 30 hostiles with elevated positions and crew-served weapons. My boys are combat effective, but we're taking fire from 3 sides. We need danger close support, and we need it 5 minutes ago. Lysander's eyes swept her instrument panel as she processed the request. Danger close meant air strikes within 600 meters of friendly forces, close enough that the margin for error measured in single-digit meters rather than football fields. It was the kind of precision work that separated the professional pilots from the weekend warriors, and everyone on the frequency knew it. Copy danger close. Marking targets now. She toggled her targeting pod to high magnification and began painting laser designators on muzzle flashes that bloomed like deadly flowers in her thermal imaging. Trident Actual, I'm seeing multiple technical vehicles with mounted weapons. Can you confirm civilians clear of target area? Negative civilian presence. This is a hardened military compound. Light 'em up, Phoenix. But Lysander hesitated. Something in the pattern of the enemy fire bothered her, too coordinated, too professional for the ragtag militia groups that usually populated these remote valleys. Her father had taught her to hunt white-tailed deer in the Oregon mountains when she was 12, and the first rule he drilled into her was simple. If something feels wrong, trust that feeling. Command, Phoenix requesting additional intelligence on compound composition. The defensive posture here suggests trained military personnel, not local militia. Webb's voice cut through the static with barely concealed irritation. Phoenix, we don't have time for tactical analysis. You have SEALs under fire and authorization for immediate air support. She banked hard left, her airframe groaning under the G-force as another burst of tracer fire reached toward her position. Someone down there had surface-to-air capability, which meant the intelligence briefing had missed more than just personnel numbers. The morning light was starting to creep across the eastern peaks when Lysander lined up her first strafing run. Through her canopy, the world below looked peaceful, just another collection of brown buildings clustered around a courtyard, indistinguishable from 1,000 other compounds scattered across Afghanistan's unforgiving landscape. But her targeting systems told a different story. Heat signatures moved with military precision between fortified positions, and the radar paint on her screen showed the distinctive electromagnetic signature of sophisticated air defense systems. Trident Actual, I'm beginning my attack run. Keep your heads down. She pushed the stick forward and felt the familiar sensation of controlled falling as her aircraft translated potential energy into kinetic death. The 20 cannon beneath her nose came alive with a sound like thunder, and streams of depleted uranium shells reached down toward the earth at 3,000 rounds per minute. The first burst caught a truck-mounted heavy machine gun position, turning metal and flesh into a brief orange bloom that faded as quickly as it had appeared. Secondary explosions followed as ammunition stores detonated in sympathetic chaos, but Lysander was already pulling up and banking for another approach. In the compound, Kowalski's voice crackled over the radio with professional appreciation. Good hits, Phoenix. You just took out their primary fire support, but I'm seeing more movement in the northern buildings. She rolled inverted and pulled through a split-S maneuver that brought her aircraft around for a second pass, this time approaching from the west with the rising sun at her back. It was an old fighter pilot trick, use the sun as camouflage until the last possible moment. As she lined up the shot, her radar warning receiver began screaming. Someone had just locked onto her aircraft with targeting radar. The missile launch came without warning, a heat-seeking serpent that climbed toward her position with malevolent purpose. Lysander's training took over, years of repetition compressed into seconds of life-or-death decision-making. She deployed chaff and flares while throwing her aircraft into a defensive spiral that pushed her G-suit to its operational limits. The blood drained from her head as centrifugal force tried to rob her brain of consciousness, but she held on and watched the missile streak past her starboard wing, confused by the metallic chaff cloud she'd left in her wake. Command, Phoenix. I'm taking SAM fire from the compound. Intelligence was wrong about the defensive capabilities here. Her voice remained steady despite the adrenaline dump that made her hands shake against the controls. Below, the SEALs were still pinned down and she was their only hope of survival. Webb's response carried the weight of a commander who was rapidly running out of options. Phoenix, you are authorized to engage all targets of opportunity. Rules of engagement are weapons-free. Lysander checked her fuel gauge and weapons inventory. She had perhaps 40 minutes of loiter time and enough ordnance to level half the compound, but something about the tactical situation still felt wrong. The defenders were too well equipped, too well positioned. This wasn't a random militia compound. It was a trap. The realization hit her just as her radar warning receiver screamed again. Two more missiles were climbing toward her position, and this time they were coming from different directions. Someone had been waiting for American air cover to arrive, and they'd been ready with a warm welcome. Trident Actual, Phoenix. I think you guys walked into something bigger than we thought. As Captain Lysander, Phoenix, Reeves threw her F-22 into another defensive maneuver, dodging the second wave of surface-to-air missiles, her mind raced through the tactical implications of what she was seeing. The compound below wasn't just well defended. It was a carefully constructed kill zone designed to lure in American Special Operations Forces and their air support. Someone with intimate knowledge of U.S. tactics had spent months preparing this trap. Phoenix, Trident Actual. We're seeing movement on the ridgelines. Looks like they're trying to flank our position. Kowalski's voice carried the controlled tension of a professional soldier who just realized that the simple extraction mission had become a fight for survival. Lysander banked hard and climbed to gain altitude, while her threat warning systems painted an increasingly complex picture. The missile sites weren't just randomly placed. They formed interlocking fields of fire that could engage aircraft from multiple angles simultaneously. Whoever had designed this killing ground understood modern air warfare better than most Pentagon planners. Command, Phoenix. I'm reading at least 6 separate SAM sites with overlapping coverage. This is a sophisticated air defense network, not some goat herders with surplus stingers. She rolled inverted to get a better view of the terrain below, her trained eye picking out camouflage positions that would have been invisible to most pilots. Webb's response came after a pause that spoke volumes about the conversations happening in the command bunker. Phoenix, what's your assessment of mission continuation? It was military speak for a simple question. Could one pilot against prepared defenses accomplish what an entire squadron might struggle with? Lysander looked at her fuel gauge again, then at the weapons display. She had 2 AIM-120 air-to-air missiles, 4 AIM-9 Sidewinders, and 800 rounds for her 20 cannon. Against 6 SAM sites and an unknown number of fighters, it wasn't overwhelming firepower. But she'd been in worse situations. Command, mission continues. I'm going to need you to trust my judgment on target prioritization. She wasn't asking for permission. She was informing them of her intent. In the cockpit of an F-22, 31,000 feet above enemy territory, there wasn't time for committee decisions. The third missile launch caught her while she was lining up a shot on the northernmost SAM site. The heat seeker climbed toward her position with the relentless patience of mechanical death, but this time Lysander was ready. Instead of defensive maneuvering, she accelerated toward the threat, using her aircraft's superior speed to close the distance before the missile's guidance system could compensate. At the last possible moment, she pulled into a vertical climb that left the missile reaching for empty sky, while she positioned herself for a devastating attack run on the launcher that had just revealed its position. The 20 rounds found their target with surgical precision, turning sophisticated electronics into expensive scrap metal in less than 3 seconds. 1 down, 5 to go. Nice shooting, Phoenix, came Kowalski's voice, carrying a note of genuine admiration. That took some serious stones. But Lysander wasn't listening to the praise. Her attention was focused on the radar display, where new contacts had just appeared on the scope. Fast movers, climbing out of the valleys to the east. Someone had called in air support of their own. The morning sky above Afghanistan was about to become very crowded, and Captain Phoenix Reeves was flying alone into the kind of air battle that military historians would write about, if anyone survived to tell the story. The first enemy aircraft appeared on Lysander's radar as she completed her attack run on the second SAM site. 2 contacts, fast and climbing, with the distinctive signature of Soviet-era MiG-29 fighters. They were older aircraft, but in the hands of competent pilots, still deadly enough to turn her technological advantage into scrap metal scattered across the Hindu Kush. Command Phoenix, I have two enemy fighters approaching from the east, MiG-29s by radar signature. She pulled into a climbing turn that showcased the F-22's superior thrust-to-weight ratio, gaining altitude and speed while keeping the enemy aircraft in her sensor envelope. Webb's voice carried new urgency. Phoenix, you are cleared to engage air-to-air targets. Priority is keeping them off the ground, team. Below, the SEALs had used the distraction of her attacks to advance on the main compound building, but they were still taking heavy fire from entrenched positions. Lysander found herself facing the classic fighter pilot's dilemma: engage the immediate air threat or continue providing close air support for the troops on the ground. Either choice carried the risk of letting the other threat develop into something lethal. She chose both. Trident Actual, I'm going to keep the MiGs busy. Use the next 60 seconds to move to better positions. Without waiting for acknowledgement, she turned toward the approaching fighters and pushed her throttles to military power. The F-22's twin engines responded with a surge of thrust that pressed her back into her ejection seat as the aircraft accelerated through Mach 1.2. The lead MiG pilot was either very brave or very stupid. He maintained his heading directly toward her aircraft despite the fact that his radar warning receiver must have been screaming about the missile lock she'd just established. At 40 miles range, well beyond the effective envelope of his own weapons, Lysander squeezed the trigger and sent an AIM-120 AMRAAM streaking toward his aircraft. The missile's flight time at that range was almost leisurely, 37 seconds from launch to impact, long enough for her to watch the enemy pilot finally wake up to his situation and begin defensive maneuvering. He deployed chaff and dove toward the deck, pulling G-forces that would have made a younger pilot black out. But the AMRAAM was patient and smart, adjusting its trajectory with each course change until it found its target in a brief orange flash that left debris falling toward the mountain peaks below. Splash 1, she reported, already turning her attention to the second MiG. This pilot had learned from his wingman's mistake and was approaching from a different angle, using the mountain terrain to mask his radar signature while he closed to within firing range of his own missiles. But Lysander had something the MiG pilot didn't: stealth technology that made her aircraft nearly invisible to his targeting systems. She disappeared from his radar screen just as he was preparing to fire, leaving him searching empty sky while she maneuvered into a position that would have made her old instructor proud. The second AIM-120 found its target before the enemy pilot even knew he'd been fired upon. Splash 2, airspace clear. The words came automatically, part of the ritual of aerial combat that reduced life-and-death struggles to clinical terminology. But as she turned back toward the compound below, Lysander allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. She just evened the odds considerably. The satisfaction didn't last long. Her radar warning receiver was painting new contacts. With the immediate air threat eliminated, Lysander turned her attention back to the compound where Team 6 remained pinned down by increasingly accurate fire. The elimination of 2 SAM sites had given her more freedom to maneuver, but 4 remained operational, and their operators had learned to be more cautious about revealing their positions. She would have to be smarter about the next phase of the engagement. Trident Actual, Phoenix, status report on your position. She maintained a holding pattern at 28,000 feet while scanning for targets, her thermal imaging picking up the heat signatures of defenders moving between buildings with military precision. Phoenix, we've advanced to the main compound, but we're taking fire from a fortified position in the central courtyard. We can't get close enough to complete the extraction without air support. Kowalski's voice carried the flat professionalism of a man who'd been in similar situations before, but Lysander could hear the underlying tension. She studied the thermal image on her targeting display. The central courtyard was surrounded by thick walls with defensive positions built into the corners, classic fortress design that had been protecting defenders in this region for centuries. Modern weapons hadn't changed the fundamental mathematics of siege warfare. Attackers needed overwhelming force or exceptional precision to succeed. Lysander had precision. Trident Tactual, I need you to mark your exact position with IR strobes. I'm coming in low and fast. She pushed the nose of her aircraft down and began descending toward the mountains, using the terrain to mask her approach from the remaining SAM sites. At 500 feet above ground level, she was flying low enough to see individual figures moving in the compound through her targeting pod. The strobes appeared as bright white stars in her thermal vision, marking the SEAL's position in the northeast corner of the compound. Between them and the main building, 3 defensive positions commanded clear fields of fire across the courtyard. Lysander selected high-explosive rounds for her cannon and began calculating angles and timing for a strafing run that would neutralize the defenders without endangering the friendlies. "Danger close, troops in contact," she muttered into her oxygen mask, repeating the mantra that governed close air support. The margin for error was measured in meters, and there would be no second chances if she miscalculated. The first strafing run turned the eastern defensive position into smoking rubble, but it also drew return fire from a shoulder-fired missile that passed close enough to her aircraft that she could see the smoke trail in her peripheral vision. Someone down there was very good at their job. "Good hits, Phoenix. 2 positions remaining." Kowalski's voice carried new hope, but Lysander was already planning her next approach. The defenders would be expecting her to attack from the same direction, so she would have to surprise them. She climbed back to altitude and approached from the south, using the morning sun as camouflage just as she had earlier. This time, her cannon fire found both remaining positions in a single devastating pass. "Trident Tactual, Phoenix, courtyard is clear. You are free to advance." But even as she spoke the words, her radar was painting new contacts approaching from the west. The day was far from over. The new contacts on Lysander's radar resolved into 4 aircraft, older model Su-25 ground attack planes that were climbing out of the valleys, with the unmistakable intent of turning the compound into a crater. The Frogfoots, as NATO had designated them, were slower than her F-22, but carried enough ordnance to flatten everything within a quarter-mile radius. If they reached the compound, Team 6's extraction would become a recovery mission. "Command, Phoenix. I have 4 Su-25s inbound from the west. They're carrying external stores, looks like cluster munitions." She banked toward the new threat while calculating intercept angles and missile engagement envelopes. 4 targets meant she would have to be economical with her remaining air-to-air missiles. "Phoenix, you are cleared to engage. Do not let those aircraft reach the compound." Webb's voice carried the weight of a commander who understood that the next few minutes would determine whether 8 American warriors came home alive or in flag-draped coffins. The lead Su-25 pilot was maintaining radio discipline, but Lysander could imagine the chatter in his cockpit as he prepared for what he probably thought would be an easy ground attack mission. The intelligence flowing to both sides had been incomplete, which meant he had no idea that an F-22 was waiting in the high-altitude sanctuary above the mountains. Lysander's first AIM-120 caught the lead aircraft completely by surprise. The pilot never knew what hit him. One moment he was flying in formation toward his target. The next moment his aircraft was an expanding ball of fire and debris tumbling toward the mountainside below. The 3 remaining Su-25 immediately broke formation and began evasive maneuvering, but they were flying aircraft designed for close air support, not air-to-air combat. Her second missile found the trailing aircraft as it attempted to dive toward the deck, using the mountains for cover. The explosion lit up the pre-dawn sky like a brief second sun, casting shadows across the peaks that stretched for miles in every direction. "Splash 3 and 4, she reported, her voice maintaining the same professional calm despite the fact that she just achieved what most fighter pilots only dreamed about: multiple kills in aerial combat. But there was no time for celebration. Two Su-25s remained, and they were now close enough to pose a direct threat to the compound. The remaining enemy pilots had learned from their wingmen's fate and were approaching low through the valley, using the terrain to mask their radar signatures while they closed to weapons range. It was smart flying, but Lysander had advantages they couldn't counter. Her stealth technology made her nearly invisible to their targeting systems, and her superior sensors could track them even when they thought they were hidden. Trident Actual, 2 more inbound. I'm going to try to take them before they can drop ordnance, but if anything gets through, you need to be ready to take cover. She rolled into a diving attack that brought her down to the same altitude as the Su-25s, trading her high-altitude advantage for the element of surprise. The engagement that followed lasted less than 30 seconds but felt like hours. Her remaining AIM-120s found their targets with the precision that American technology was famous for, turning 2 more aircraft into falling debris that impacted the mountainside in twin fireballs visible for dozens of miles. But as the last explosion faded, Lysander's radar warning receiver began painting new contacts. More aircraft were approaching from multiple directions, and her weapons inventory was running dangerously low. The war was just getting started. As the sun crested the eastern peaks and painted the mountains in shades of gold and amber, Lysander found herself facing a tactical situation that would have challenged an entire squadron. Her weapons inventory showed 2 AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles and 400 rounds of 20 ammunition, enough for perhaps 2 more engagements if she was both skillful and lucky. Meanwhile, her radar was tracking 6 new contacts approaching from 3 different directions. "Command, Phoenix. I'm seeing multiple groups of aircraft converging on this location. Someone really wants that compound destroyed." She maintained a defensive patrol pattern while studying the enemy formations, looking for weaknesses in their approach that she could exploit. Webb's voice when it came was tight with controlled stress. "Phoenix, we're working on getting you back up, but the nearest fighters are 40 minutes out. Can you hold until then?" 40 minutes. Lysander did quick mental calculations involving fuel consumption, weapons inventory, and the mathematical certainty that 6 enemy aircraft could not all be destroyed with the ordnance she had remaining. The smart tactical decision would be to withdraw and wait for reinforcements, but that would mean abandoning Team 6 to whatever fate the enemy had planned for them. "Command, 40 minutes is a negative, but I don't need 40 minutes. I need 10. She pushed her throttles forward and began climbing toward the new threat, her aircraft's twin engines screaming as they translated jet fuel into raw kinetic energy. The first group consisted of 2 more MiG-29s approaching from the northwest. Unlike their earlier counterparts, these pilots were flying smart, maintaining altitude and separation while using their onboard radars to search for her aircraft. They knew an American fighter was in the area, and they were being cautious about closing to weapons range. Lysander used their caution against them. While they searched the high-altitude blocks where they expected to find her, she descended to 15,000 feet and approached from their 6 o'clock position. The F-22 stealth technology was most effective when viewed from certain angles, and she positioned herself in their radar blind spot before launching her first Sidewinder from minimum range. The infrared-guided missile tracked the heat signature of the lead MiG's engines and detonated just behind the cockpit, breaking the aircraft's spine and sending it tumbling out of control toward the valley below. His wingman had approximately 3 seconds to process what had happened before Lysander's second Sidewinder found his aircraft as well. Splash 5 and 6. She was down to cannon ammunition now, which meant the remaining 4 aircraft would have to be engaged in visual range, the kind of close-quarters aerial combat that hadn't been common since World War II. Below in the compound, Kowalski's team had used the distraction of the air battle to advance toward the main building where their extraction target was supposedly being held. But as they breached the outer walls, they discovered that intelligence had been wrong about more than just the defensive capabilities. Phoenix, Trident Actual, the package isn't here. This whole compound is empty except for the guys shooting at us. Kowalski's voice carried the bitter realization that they'd walked into an elaborate trap for nothing. No high-value target, no actionable intelligence, just a kill zone designed to eliminate American special operations capability. Copy that, Trident Actual. Recommend immediate extraction to primary LZ. Lysander was tracking the final 4 aircraft as they approached from the southeast, another pair of Su-25s with what looked like a fighter escort. Her ammunition counter showed 347 rounds remaining, which would have to be enough. The final engagement began when the enemy formation split up, with the fighters climbing to engage her while the ground attack aircraft dove toward the compound. Lysander made the instantaneous decision that would define the remainder of the battle. Instead of engaging the fighters, she dove after the Su-25s. It was a calculated risk that depended on her ability to destroy the ground attack threat before the fighters could bring their weapons to bear. As she lined up behind the lead Su-25, she could see the cluster bombs hanging beneath its wings, enough explosive power to turn the compound and everyone in it into a crater. Her cannon fire walked up the Su-25 fuselage from tail to cockpit, critical systems failing in sequence, until the aircraft became an uncontrolled missile aimed at the mountainside. The second Su-25 lasted only slightly longer before her remaining ammunition found its target. Behind her, the escort fighters were closing fast, and she was out of missiles. The dogfight that followed would be discussed in fighter pilot training programs for decades to come. With no missiles remaining and limited cannon ammunition, Lysander was forced to rely on superior aircraft performance and tactical flying that pushed both her and her aircraft to their absolute limits. The enemy pilots were skilled and aggressive, but they were flying older aircraft against the most advanced fighter jet ever built. She used the F-22's thrust vectoring capability to execute maneuvers that seemed to defy physics, staying inside the turning radius of aircraft that should have been able to outturn her while positioning herself for brief cannon shots that had to count. Each burst of 20 fire was precious, and she couldn't afford to waste rounds on low-probability shots. The first enemy fighter fell to a perfectly timed burst that caught him as he climbed out of a defensive turn, the depleted uranium rounds shredding his starboard wing and sending him into an unrecoverable spin. The second pilot lasted longer, forcing Lysander into a vertical scissors maneuver that carried both aircraft from 30,000 feet down to the deck before her final cannon burst found its mark. Splash 7 and 8, airspace clear. The words came out between heavy breathing as she pulled out of her final dive and climbed back toward safety. Her ammunition counter showed 0 rounds remaining, but the immediate threats had been neutralized. Below in the compound, Team 6 was already moving toward their extraction point, their mission complete despite the lack of their intended target. They'd survived because one pilot had been willing to take on impossible odds. Phoenix, Trident Actual, I don't know how you did that, but we owe you 8 lives. Kowalski's voice carried a respect that hadn't been there at the beginning of the mission. But Lysander wasn't thinking about gratitude or recognition. Her fuel gauge was showing critical levels, and she was still 200 miles from the nearest friendly airfield. The hardest part of the mission was just beginning. As Captain Lysander Phoenix, Reeves turned toward home with her fuel gauge dropping into the red zone. The radio crackled with transmissions that revealed the true scope of what had just transpired. The compound they'd been sent to assault hadn't been a terrorist hideout or militia stronghold. It had been an elaborate trap set by a foreign intelligence service, with access to American operational planning. Phoenix Command, "We're getting reports from SIGINT that the whole operation was compromised from the beginning. Someone leaked the mission parameters." Webb's voice carried the kind of exhaustion that came from realizing that American lives had been risked for an operation that enemy forces had been expecting for weeks. Lysander adjusted her heading toward Bagram Airfield while calculating fuel consumption rates against distance remaining. The mathematics were unforgiving. She had perhaps 20 minutes of fuel left and 30 minutes of flying time to reach safety. In civilian aviation, it would be an emergency. In combat aviation over hostile territory, it was just another day at the office. "Command, I'm going to need priority landing clearance at Bagram. Fuel state is critical." She began shutting down non-essential systems to conserve what little fuel remained, her training taking over as she prepared for what might become a deadstick landing. Behind her, black smoke columns rose from the compound where 8 different aircraft had met their end in the span of 40 minutes. The morning sun illuminated the debris field scattered across several square miles of Afghan mountainside, testament to an air battle that had pitted one American pilot against impossible odds. But the real victory wasn't measured in aircraft destroyed or missions completed. It was measured in the fact that 8 Navy SEALs were flying home in their extraction helicopter instead of being shipped home in aluminum boxes. That was the kind of mathematics that mattered to Lysander. "Phoenix, Bagram Tower. You are cleared for priority approach runway 27. Emergency vehicles are standing by." The air traffic controller's voice carried the professional calm of someone who'd handled dozens of fuel-critical landings, but there was an undertone of respect that hadn't been there in her previous communications with ground control. Word of her solo engagement had spread through the military communications network with the speed that only significant events achieved. By the time she touched down at Bagram with less than 5 minutes of fuel remaining, ground crews and maintenance personnel had gathered along the taxiway to watch the aircraft that had just changed the tactical situation in an entire theater of operations. As she shut down her engines and began the post-flight checklist, Lysander reflected on the morning's events. She'd started the day as just another pilot in a squadron full of experienced aviators. She was ending it as something different, a pilot who'd proven that superior training and equipment, combined with the kind of tactical thinking that couldn't be taught in flight school, could overcome numerical disadvantages that should have been insurmountable. The canopy opened with a mechanical whir, and she was greeted by the familiar smell of jet fuel and Afghan dust. Ground crew members approached her aircraft with the kind of deference usually reserved for much more senior officers, and she realized that something fundamental had changed in how she was perceived by her peers. But the war was far from over, and there would be other missions, other challenges that would test both her skills and her resolve. As she climbed down from the cockpit and began the lengthy debriefing process that followed every combat mission, Lysander couldn't shake the feeling that the morning's engagement had been just the opening move in a much larger game. Someone with access to American operational planning had orchestrated the trap that nearly cost Team 6 their lives. Until that someone was identified and neutralized, every mission would carry the same risks that had made her morning flight so dangerous. The intelligence briefing that followed Lysander's landing revealed the scope of the security breach that had nearly turned a routine extraction into a massacre. The compound's coordinates, approach routes, and timing had all been provided to enemy forces at least 72 hours before the mission launched. Someone with access to classified operational planning had been feeding information to hostile intelligence services. "Captain Reeves, what you accomplished this morning was exceptional, but it also revealed something troubling about our operational security." General Patricia Hayes, the theater commander, had flown to Bagram specifically to debrief the pilot who'd single-handedly prevented what could have been the worst special operations disaster since Operation Red Wings. Lysander sat in the sterile briefing room, still wearing her flight suit, her helmet resting on the metal table between her and an array of intelligence officers who looked like they hadn't slept in days. The events of the morning felt distant already, compressed into technical details and tactical reports that reduced life-and-death combat to dry military terminology. Ma'am, the defensive setup in that compound wasn't improvised. Someone spent significant time and resources preparing that kill zone. She pulled up tactical photographs on the briefing room's display screen, pointing to details that revealed the scope of the preparation. The SAM sites were positioned for overlapping coverage. The defensive positions were pre-built for interlocking fields of fire, and the enemy air response was coordinated with ground operations. That level of preparation requires advance warning. General Hayes nodded grimly. Our counterintelligence teams are already investigating, but we have to assume that ongoing operations may be compromised. What's your assessment of enemy air capabilities in this region? Lysander considered the question carefully. The MiG-29s she'd engaged had been flown by competent pilots using sound tactical doctrine. They hadn't been the undisciplined amateurs that populated most enemy air forces in the region. Ma'am, the pilots I engaged this morning were professionals. Their tactical flying was consistent with formal military training, not the improvised tactics we usually see from militia air forces. Someone is providing advanced pilot training along with aircraft and weapons systems. The implications were sobering. A professionally trained and equipped enemy air force in the region would complicate every aspect of American operations. The air superiority that had defined the conflict for over a decade could no longer be taken for granted. Captain, I'm assigning you to a new mission profile. Your squadron will be responsible for air superiority operations in this sector, with particular focus on identifying and neutralizing enemy air capabilities. General Hayes slid a classified folder across the table. This is above your current clearance level, but given this morning's events, I'm authorizing emergency access. Lysander opened the folder and found satellite imagery showing multiple airfields across the region, many of them previously unknown to American intelligence. Aircraft revetments, maintenance facilities, and fuel storage areas were clearly visible in the high-resolution photographs. Someone had been building an air force in plain sight, while American satellites had been looking in other directions. Ma'am, this changes everything. If they have this kind of air capability, every operation in the region is at risk. Which is why you're going to help us do something about it. General Hayes stood and moved to the wall-mounted map that showed the entire Afghan theater of operations. Tomorrow night, you'll be leading a strike package against the primary air